Welcome to the Liberty News Hour. I'm Dr. Duke with the New American, and it has been a very revealing week in American politics. At the beginning of the week, we had a huge problem with the city of Baltimore back in the news, and this really surprises me because Baltimore has been a train wreck for a long time, and people haven't been talking about it. We have a major big city like Baltimore mayor step down in scandal. We had all sorts of anti-police rhetoric and violence coming from City Hall. We have just horrible conditions on the streets. It's probably the one big city on the East Coast that has San Francisco aspirations when it comes to garbage in the streets and rat infestations. Baltimore has been an all-around mess. But we haven't talked about that. We haven't had anything to say about that. It's been largely out of the mainstream news cycle. On the other hand, Donald Trump speaks about the conditions in Baltimore, and suddenly Baltimore is front and center. And what happened? Well, as you know, Representative Elijah Cummings, one of the most long-serving members of the U.S. Congress, recently attacked Donald Trump. And also, while we had this situation that happened a few weeks ago where on the floor of the Congress, Nancy Pelosi actually called President Trump a racist by name. And according to long-standing congressional behavioral patterns, that's not allowed. You're not allowed to personalize your politics. You can talk generally on the floor of Congress. You can generalize or speak broadly, but you have no right to attack individual people. When she did that, it was Elijah Cummings whose job it was to censor her. He should have immediately censored her for what she said. He was pressured to do so, which would have meant a 24-hour ban for Speaker Pelosi from the Congress. But he didn't do it. In fact, he did something even worse. He walked away. He simply put down his gavel and walked away and ignored his responsibility. Well, this triggered in Donald Trump a response in which he called out Representative Cummings for his behavior in the Congress, but also for the shoddy job he's done over decades and decades as being a representative from Baltimore. He said at one point, quote, Representative Elijah Cummings has been a brutal bully, shouting and screaming at the great men and women of Border Patrol about conditions at the southern border, when actually his Baltimore district is far worse and more dangerous. That's a direct quote from Donald Trump. And, of course, the American left called that racist. And I wanted to read it to you word for word because there is absolutely nothing racist in that statement. It's absolutely true that Cummings has been perhaps the longest-serving politician in Baltimore in recent memory. He's been there and overseen this from beginning to end, number one. Number two, he actually has been screaming about how horrible our Border Patrol agents are treating immigrants on the southern border, which isn't true. And three, he neglects the fact that in some ways, what's going on in Baltimore makes what's happening on the border look relatively tame in certain areas. So when Donald Trump came out and said, quote, it's far worse in some areas and more dangerous to be in Baltimore, inner city Baltimore, than certain aspects of the border, he was right. But what does it tell us that the American progressive left saw this immediately as racism? Step back for a second. Who is it? Who is it that controls primarily most of the big cities in this country? It's liberal Democrats. They have for a long time. When you think of places like New York City or Los Angeles, California, San Francisco, Chicago, you think about the major metropolitan areas in this country. Most of them are controlled by radical liberal politicians, leftist Democrats. And the irony about this is that we're not allowed to criticize them, especially if any of those leaders happen to be minorities. And in the case of Elijah Cummings, you have a situation like this where you have a big city, Baltimore, run by primarily African Americans at most levels of government. Cummings has overseen Baltimore as a congressman for a long time now. And the worse these cities get, take San Francisco too, Nancy Pelosi's district, where you have all of this drug paraphernalia in the streets. You've got feces piled high. You've got rats. Same thing in Los Angeles. The fact is now, according to the American left, to criticize high-ranking, powerful politicians who happen to be minorities or women, that is now considered racism and misogyny. This is how far the leftist police, political and linguistic police, have prospered in America. That to even question The paradox of this is what gets me. You got somebody like Barack Obama. Remember, for 8 years, we listened to the fact that to criticize Barack Obama was racism. Didn't matter what Barack Obama did or said. Didn't matter what kind of impact those policies had on America, his policies had in American life. Negative. Didn't matter. If you criticized Barack Obama for 8 years, you were a racist. Now we see how that has bled over. If you are a high-ranking woman like Nancy Pelosi, if you are someone like Elijah Cummings, has a lot of responsibility for what's taken place in Baltimore for a lot of years, to criticize them now is racist. You can't even raise an objection to their policies. You can't point out the logical consequences of what leftism does. And this is, I think, where I want to go. You can no longer in this country point to the broken promises. You can't point to the lost opportunities. You can't point to the misery, the unhappiness, the tax burden, the attacks on our institutions, our police, and our Constitution. You can't even point to that anymore if minorities are in charge. I've said for a long time that the trap was closing in on us as conservative and Christian and Republican and libertarian thinkers. That trap was the trap that suggests free speech is being rewritten. That under the guise of racism and sexism and bigotry, the First Amendment, free speech, is under radical attack by the progressives. And we're seeing now, and I think this is absolutely true, we are no longer outside of the trap waiting for it to close. We are now inside the trap. We are now inside a system where the grounded assumptions of the American media, of the mainstream media, of academia, of our middle and public school, high schools. We are now of Hollywood, our entertainment community, of many of our progressive politicians. They're all arguing from a perspective that no one on the right seems to challenge. And that perspective is what we just talked about. That if you say anything to criticize the performance, however justified it may be, however factually, demonstrably true it may be, of leftist politicians and leftist policies, you're now guilty of racism and bigotry. This is a big problem, and it's going to get a lot worse. George Orwell warned us about this doublespeak, right? That the worse progressivism performs, the more we have to talk about its accomplishments. It's very Soviet. It's a very Soviet Marxist model of discourse. But in this country now, and we throw into that the tech giants. Now we have major tech companies who are actually censoring conservative critiques of liberals, if they happen to be minorities, for no other reason than racism. And so this isn't going to end very well for our republic. We've seen how the progressive left has come full throttle for the Second Amendment. They are really after the First Amendment now, and ironically, they're making more progress, it seems to me, undermining First Amendment rights than they have ever been able to make undermining our Second Amendment rights. We have got to stand up. We need more conservative and Republican politicians and rank-and-file Americans to stand up and say, look, if you have the power of government, you have the power of Congress, you have the power to be a president or a senator, and you happen to be a minority, then put your big boy pants on and recognize that you are in control. You're no longer victims. If you are some of the most powerful men and women in the world, you can no longer hide behind your victim status. If you are Elijah Cummings and you preside over a city like Baltimore, which is, as Donald Trump said, a blank hole. Hard to deny it when you've got runaway vermin in the streets. You've got lawlessness. You've got corruption at every level of state government, of city government. It's hard to argue that that appellation is incorrect. Take advantage, take responsibility for those behaviors and fix them. Same thing goes for Nancy Pelosi in California. You cannot pretend to be a victim, Nancy. When your own city, San Francisco, is a travesty. It's a place where people can't afford to live, where rents are too high, where tech giants rule everything, where you've got chaos and feces in the street. What we need to get back to is genuine adherence to the First Amendment. Don't let the left do this to you, America. Don't buy the premise. Don't buy the premise that criticism of powerful, rich, wealthy, privileged, influential minorities is the same thing as racism. You can't be a racist. You can't play the racism card and yet have all that power. You are responsible for the cities you govern, and most of those big liberal cities you govern are a fantastic mess. So we need to get back on track with this. Donald Trump, if he does nothing else as president for 4 and hopefully 8 years, doing that, getting us back to a way where we can call a thing what it is, where you can label stupidity, regardless of the person who is there, then we'll have a winning system again. Thanks for joining us. I'm Dr. Duke with the New American Magazine, and this has been my take on the news.